The iron gates of the Golden Dragon estate stood like the bars of a fortress, cold and unyielding against the gray San Francisco fog. Liam Moore adjusted the strap of his faded delivery bag, feeling the weight of the single envelope tucked inside. It wasn't heavy, but to him, it felt like it weighed 100 pounds. His uniform was thin, the fabric pilling at the elbows, and the damp air seemed to soak right through to his skin. He looked down at his shoes, cheap sneakers with a sole that was starting to peel away, and then back up at the security camera perched atop the stone pillar. He wasn't supposed to be here. He knew that, but he had promised his mother, and a promise to a dying woman was the only thing he had left that mattered. He pressed the intercom button, his heart hammering against his ribs. A voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and suspicious, demanding to know his business. Liam cleared his throat, trying to sound braver than he felt. He explained he had a personal delivery for Mr. Arthur Chen, but the line went dead before he could finish. A few minutes later, the massive gates began to groan open, but not for him. A sleek, obsidian black luxury sedan glided through the opening, its tires whispering against the pristine gravel. The car came to a smooth halt just past the gatehouse. The back door opened, and a man stepped out who seemed to radiate power and old-world authority. Arthur Chen looked exactly like the photos Liam had seen, but the reality was far more intimidating. His suit was a masterpiece of charcoal wool, tailored so perfectly it didn't show a single wrinkle, and his hair was swept back in a silver mane that commanded respect. He didn't look at Liam, he looked through him, as if he were a smudge on a window that needed to be cleaned away. The air suddenly grew colder as a second person entered the scene. Mrs. Gable, a neighbor from the sprawling estate next door, came walking down the sidewalk with a designer leash in one hand and a tiny, yapping poodle in the other. She stopped near the car, her nose wrinkling as if she had just smelled something rotting. She adjusted her oversized sunglasses and let out a sharp, jagged laugh. She looked Liam up and down, lingering on his worn-out shoes and the faint stain on his delivery shirt. She told Arthur that he really needed to talk to the homeowners association about the security, because honestly, people like this were starting to make the neighborhood feel like a trailer park. Arthur didn't laugh, but a cruel, thin smile touched his lips. He finally turned his gaze to Liam, his dark eyes narrowing with a deep-seated prejudice that went back decades. Liam took a step forward, his voice trembling as he held out the damp envelope. He told Arthur that it was from Mei-Ling, that it was important, but Arthur didn't even reach for it. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence looming over the younger man. He spoke in a low, dangerous tone, asking Liam if he really thought a cheap disguise and a sob story would get him a handout. He told Liam that people of his kind, people with no heritage, no class, and no bloodline worth mentioning, didn't belong on this side of the gate. With a sudden, dismissive flick of his wrist, Arthur slapped the letter out of Liam's hand. The envelope fluttered through the air and landed face down in a muddy puddle of rainwater. Mrs. Gable chuckled, cooing to her dog about how some people just didn't know their place in the world. Arthur turned his back on his grandson, adjusted his cufflinks, and stepped back into the warmth of his leather-scented car without a second thought. As the sedan pulled away, splashing muddy water onto Liam's jeans, the gates began to swing shut again with a heavy, final thud. Liam stood alone in the rain, the sound of the yapping dog fading into the distance. He knelt down in the mud, his fingers shaking as he fished the soaked letter out of the puddle. The ink was already starting to bleed, blurring the elegant cursive of his mother's handwriting. He didn't cry. The time for tears had passed years ago. He pulled his wallet from his pocket and opened it to a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a weathered photograph of a radiant young Asian woman holding a blue-eyed baby. He looked at the woman in the photo, then at the towering mansion behind the bars. He tucked the letter into his bag and stood up straight, his jaw setting into a hard, determined line. He hadn't come for money, and he hadn't come for a home. He had come to give Arthur Chen a chance at a soul, and the old man had just thrown it away. As Liam walked away from the Golden Dragon, he knew one thing for certain. The next time these gates opened for him, he wouldn't be asking for permission to enter. The mahogany-walled study felt more like a courtroom than a home. 30 years ago, the air in this very room had been thick with the scent of expensive cigars and a cold, clinical fury. A younger Arthur Chen sat behind his desk, his silhouette sharp and predatory against the window. His daughter, Mei-Ling, stood trembling on the other side of the desk, her fingers digging into the fabric of her skirt. She had just shared the news that should have been a blessing, but in this house, it was a death sentence. She was in love, and she was carrying a child. Arthur's reaction wasn't one of fatherly concern, it was a calculation of brand management. He didn't ask if she was happy or if the father was a good man. He only asked about the lineage. When Mei-Ling confessed that the man she loved was a working-class American student, Arthur's face transformed into a mask of pure, frozen hatred. He told her quite clearly that a half-breed child was a stain on 5,000 years of ancestry. He gave her an ultimatum that chilled her to the bone. Abort the child and never see the man again, or leave the house and be dead to the family forever. Mei-Ling chose the light. That night, under a sky that wept a relentless, freezing rain, she was shoved out of the heavy front doors. She carried a single suitcase that contained more memories than clothes. Arthur watched from the balcony, his arms crossed, his expression devoid of a single ounce of regret. He didn't offer her a coat or a cab. He simply watched his only daughter disappear into the dark, erasing her from his ledgers and his heart in one stroke. He convinced himself that purity was worth the price of loneliness, a lie he would tell himself for the next 3 decades. The years that followed were a grueling masterclass in survival. Liam's earliest memories weren't of grand estates or luxury cars, but of the rhythmic humming of a laundromat at 2 in the morning. He remembered the smell of cheap detergent and the sight of his mother's hands, cracked and red from scrubbing floors and stocking shelves. They lived in a cramped apartment where the heater rattled like a dying animal and the windows let in the biting winter wind. Mei-Ling worked 3 jobs, her body thinning and her eyes growing weary, but she never let the light go out. She would sit with Liam at a small plastic table, counting out nickels and dimes just to buy him a birthday cupcake, yet she never spoke a single word of bitterness about the man who had abandoned them. She taught Liam that dignity wasn't something you inherited, it was something you built when you had nothing else left. When the illness finally came for her, it was a slow, agonizing theft. By the time Liam was 20, his mother was a shadow of herself, her lungs failing because she couldn't afford the specialists that could have saved her. On her final night, her voice a mere whisper, she took Liam's hand and made him promise to go to his grandfather. Not for the money, she insisted, but because a family shouldn't end in silence. She wanted Liam to be the bridge that she couldn't be. Liam watched the life leave her eyes in a sterile hospital room, his heart breaking as he realized she had died of a poverty that her own father could have cured with the pocket change in his silk trousers. Returning to the present, Liam stood in the drizzling rain outside the Golden Dragon gates, his hands still stinging from the cold contact of the mud. He looked at his own skin, fair and pale, the very thing his grandfather loathed. He felt the weight of 30 years of his mother's suffering pressing down on his shoulders. He had tried to do it her way. He had tried to lead with his heart, offering a letter of peace, and he had been met with the same venom that had cast his mother into the street. The quiet dignity he had inherited was still there, but beneath it, a new fire was beginning to burn. He realized now that Arthur Chen wouldn't be moved by a letter or a plea for mercy. Men who worshipped power only understood one language. As Liam looked up at the security cameras one last time, the grief in his eyes began to settle into a hard, crystalline resolve. He wasn't just Mei-Ling's son anymore, he was the consequence of Arthur's cruelty. He would fulfill his mother's wish for a reunion, but it wouldn't be on Arthur's terms. It would be on his. The air inside the Golden Dragon's grand ballroom was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the cloying musk of high-end cologne. Crystal chandeliers cast a sharp, diamond-like glitter over the crowd of San Francisco's elite, who moved in a sea of silk and tuxedos. Liam stood near the edge of the champagne station, his back stiff and his hands tucked into white cotton gloves that didn't quite hide the roughness of his skin. He was wearing a borrowed waiter's vest that was tied across the shoulders, a temporary employee from an agency, hired to blend into the background like the furniture. He kept his head down, moving with a quiet, practiced efficiency, serving the very people who wouldn't look him in the eye. David, Arthur's longtime executive assistant, moved through the crowd with a clipboard, his expression a mask of professional neutrality. As he passed the drink station, his pace slowed. He paused, his eyes lingering on Liam's profile. There was something about the set of the young man's jaw, a haunting echo of Mei-Ling's defiance, that made David's breath hitch. He checked his notes, then looked back at Liam, a flicker of recognition and deep, hidden sympathy crossing his face. But he said nothing. In Arthur Chen's world, speaking up for the marginalized was a quick way to find yourself on the street. David adjusted his glasses and moved on, leaving Liam to the mercy of the lions. The evening reached its peak when Arthur stepped onto the velvet-draped podium, the house lights dimming to spotlight his polished, arrogant frame. He began a speech about the Chen Legacy Foundation, waxing poetic about the importance of tradition, excellence, and the preservation of heritage. The crowd hung on every word, until Arthur's eyes scanned the room and locked onto a server carrying a tray of empty flutes. His voice faltered for a fraction of a second. He recognized the beggar from the gate. A slow, poisonous heat rose in Arthur's chest. He couldn't believe the audacity of this boy to infiltrate his inner sanctum. Arthur didn't wait for his speech to end to strike. He raised a hand, silencing the polite applause, and pointed a long, bony finger directly at Liam. He told the room that there was a security breach, his voice booming with a false sense of righteous indignation. He claimed that a valuable heirloom, a diamond-encrusted watch, had gone missing from the display in the foyer just as this young man had walked past. The room went deathly silent. Every head turned toward Liam. The weight of 100 judgmental stares felt like physical blows. Mrs. Gable, sensing an opportunity to play the hero of the high class, stepped forward with a dramatic gasp. She clutched her pearls, her voice shrill and accusatory. She told the crowd that she had seen him. She claimed she saw Liam, skulking around the jewelry cases with a suspicious look in his eyes, whispering that, "You can always tell the desperate ones by how they look at things they'll never own." She demanded that someone call the police immediately before he could sneak away with the family jewels. Liam stood frozen, the silver tray trembling in his hands. He tried to speak, to say that he had been in the kitchen the entire time, but Arthur cut him off with a sneer that dripped with condescension. Arthur told him to shut his mouth, calling him a common thief who thought he could use a pretty face to scam his way into a life he hadn't earned. He signaled to the heavy-set security guards at the doors. Liam looked around the room for a single friendly face, but he found only coldness and the glint of expensive cameras as guests began to record his humiliation. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers soon strobed against the high-arched windows. The officers moved in quickly, their boots thudding loudly on the polished marble. They didn't ask questions, they followed the direction of the wealthiest man in the room. Liam felt the cold steel of the handcuffs bite into his wrists. He was spun around, his face pressed briefly against a cold stone pillar as they searched him. He felt the sting of tears, not from fear, but from the sheer, crushing injustice of it all. As he was led through the center of the ballroom, Arthur stood on the podium, looking down at him with the satisfaction of a man who had just crushed an insect under his boot. In the shadows near the coat check, David watched the police lead Liam away. His hand reached into the pocket of his blazer, his fingers brushing against a cold, hard object. Earlier that evening, he had seen Mrs. Gable accidentally drop her watch into her own oversized designer handbag while she was distracted by a glass of Chardonnay. He knew the truth. He knew the watch wasn't stolen. But as Arthur's eyes swept the room, looking for a witness to confirm his power, David lowered his head and squeezed his eyes shut. He remained silent, letting the innocent man be dragged into the night, while the elite went back to their champagne and their lies. The fluorescent lights of the holding cell hummed with a headache-inducing buzz, reflecting off the cold, stainless steel bench where Liam sat with his head in his hands. He had spent 24 hours in a state of suspended animation, the smell of floor wax and stale coffee clinging to his clothes. When the heavy iron door finally groaned open, the officer didn't offer an apology. He simply tossed Liam's meager belongings, a cheap wallet, a set of keys, and a water-damaged phone, into a plastic bin and told him the charges had been dropped for lack of evidence. There was no mention of the diamond watch, No mention of the billionaire who had pointed a finger at him like a judge sentencing a criminal. Liam stepped out into the blinding midday sun, the city of San Francisco moving on around him as if his world hadn't just imploded. He checked his phone to find a flurry of missed calls and a single, blunt text message from the catering agency. "Don't bother coming back. We don't employ thieves." He trudged back to his small, basement-level studio apartment only to find a bright yellow notice taped to the door. His landlord, a man who had never liked the quiet kid with the sad eyes, had used the arrest as an excuse to invoke a morality clause. His few belongings were already packed into 3 cardboard boxes sitting in the damp hallway. In the span of a single day, Arthur Chen had managed to strip Liam of his job, his home, and his reputation without ever getting his own hands dirty. Liam sat on the floor of the hallway, surrounded by the remnants of his life, feeling a hollow cavern of despair opening up in his chest. He reached into one of the boxes and pulled out his mother's old wooden trunk, the one she had guarded like a treasure chest until her final breath. He ran his fingers over the scarred wood, seeking some kind of comfort. As he shifted the trunk, a loose piece of the velvet lining snagged on his fingernail. He pulled at it absent-mindedly, expecting it to tear, but instead, the entire bottom panel shifted. Underneath the false floor lay a yellowed envelope, sealed with wax that bore a crest Liam didn't recognize. He opened it with trembling fingers, expecting perhaps more old photos or a lock of hair. Instead, he pulled out a thick, legal document printed on heavy vellum, a land deed dated 40 years ago. As he scanned the dense, formal English, his heart skipped a beat. The document wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a revelation. It stated that the land upon which the Golden Dragon estate was built had never been legally transferred to Arthur Chen. Liam's great-grandfather, a man of secret foresight who had seen his son's gambling debts and erratic temper, had placed the property into a protected trust. The beneficiary wasn't Arthur, it was Mei-Ling Chen and her rightful biological heirs. The realization hit Liam like a physical blow. Arthur didn't own the mansion. He didn't own the grounds. He was a squatter in a palace that legally belonged to the very white son he had just discarded like trash. A strange, cold calm began to wash over Liam, replacing the heat of his anger. He wasn't a victim anymore. He wasn't a server or a delivery boy or a beggar. He was the landlord. He looked at the deed, then at the dirty walls of the apartment hallway, and he began to laugh, a low, quiet sound that echoed off the cramped walls. He wasn't going to call the police, and he wasn't going to go back to the gates to scream and shout. That was what Arthur expected. Instead, Liam reached for his phone and began searching for the most prestigious international estate law firm in the city. He didn't need a handout, he needed a shark. The victim in him died in that hallway. He spent his last $100 on a haircut and a clean, sharp shirt from a thrift store. He walked with a new posture, his shoulders back and his gaze level. As he stepped into the glass and steel lobby of the law firm, he didn't look like a man who had just lost everything. He looked like a man who was about to take it all back. He sat in the waiting room, watching the wealthy executives strut past, and he smiled to himself. Arthur Chen thought he had ended the story at the charity auction, but Liam was just getting to the prologue. The long game had begun, and for the first time in his life, Liam Moore held all the cards. The following 3 months were a masterclass in invisible warfare. Liam moved into a cramped motel on the outskirts of the city, a place where the walls were thin enough to hear the sirens and the carpet smelled of stale cigarettes and regret. Every morning, while the sun was still a bruised purple on the horizon, he would sit at a small laminate table, surrounded by stacks of legal precedents and property records. He lived on instant noodles and tap water, pouring every cent of his meager savings into the retainers for the high-priced legal team that now worked in the shadows. He didn't mind the hunger. It felt like a familiar companion, a sharp reminder of what his mother had endured for 20 years. Every document signed and every court filing processed felt like a brick being removed from the foundation of the Golden Dragon estate. High above the city, in a corner office made of glass and arrogance, Arthur Chen was living a completely different reality. He was at the zenith of his hubris, frequently seen clinking crystal tumblers of aged scotch with tech moguls and city officials. To Arthur, Liam was a ghost he had successfully exorcised, a minor nuisance crushed under the heel of his Italian leather loafers. He spent his afternoons finalizing a massive deal to sell the estate and the surrounding acreage to a global tech conglomerate for a staggering profit. He would walk through his marble hallways, snapping his fingers at staff and barking orders, convinced that his legacy was finally secure. He even took a moment during a board meeting to mock the entitled losers, protesting for fair housing outside his building, laughing as he told his colleagues that some people were simply born to serve and others were born to rule. But beneath the surface, the tide was turning. Liam began a series of clandestine meetings with David, Arthur's assistant, who had finally reached his breaking point. They met in a dimly lit diner where the steam from the coffee obscured their faces. David handed over a thin manila envelope containing internal memos that proved Arthur had been using the estate as collateral for high-interest private loans to cover his company's failing overseas ventures. David's voice was a low, urgent whisper as he confessed that he couldn't live with the guilt of what happened to Mei-Ling anymore. Liam listened in silence, his expression unreadable, accepting the documents with a steady hand. He wasn't just taking the house. He was systematically dismantling the web of debt that Arthur had spun to keep his empire afloat. The hints of the coming storm were subtle, but they were everywhere. Arthur's phone would ring, and he would find a lawyer on the other end asking for clarification on title insurance, which he would dismissively hand off to a junior staffer. He began to suffer from a persistent, dry cough that rattled in his chest, a physical manifestation of the rot within his life, but he refused to see a doctor, believing himself invincible. Meanwhile, Liam was making his own moves, quietly purchasing the debt notes Arthur had scattered across the city through a series of anonymous shell companies. By the time the final court order was signed and sealed with a heavy red stamp, Liam didn't just own the land, he owned Arthur's future. He sat in his motel room, looking at the official termination notice, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself a single, cold smile. The trap was set, the prey was unsuspecting, and the trash Arthur thought he had discarded was about to become his landlord. The Golden Dragon estate was transformed into a glittering cathedral of excess for the Victory Gala. Valet drivers in crisp white uniforms lined the driveway, whisking away Maseratis and Bentleys, while a red carpet stretched toward the massive mahogany doors like a tongue of fire. Inside, the air hummed with the sound of a live string quartet and the artificial laughter of people who valued bank accounts over souls. Arthur Chen stood at the center of the ballroom, the undisputed king of his domain. He looked radiant in a custom tuxedo, holding a glass of vintage crystal, his chest puffed out with the pride of a man who believed he had finally won the game of life. Beside him, Mrs. Gable was draped in emerald silk and enough diamonds to light a small village, leaning in to whisper a joke about how clean the air felt now that the riffraff had been cleared out of the neighborhood. Arthur moved toward the velvet-draped stage, clinking his glass with a silver fountain pen to command the room's attention. He began to speak, his voice projected with the practiced resonance of a man used to being obeyed. He talked about legacy, about the purity of vision required to build an empire, and how today marked the final sale of the estate to a tech giant, a deal that would cement his name in the history books forever. He took a long, condescending pause, scanning the crowd of sycophants before adding that true success was only for those with the right blood and the right background. He let out a dry, mocking chuckle, mentioning that even a few months ago, a lowly beggar had tried to claim a stake in this greatness, but he had been dealt with appropriately. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom creaked open, cutting through Arthur's laughter. The sound was sharp, like a gunshot in a library. A man walked in, moving with a steady, unhurried grace that drew every eye in the room. He wasn't wearing a tattered delivery uniform or a waiter's vest. He was dressed in a navy suit so perfectly tailored it made Arthur's look like a rental. His hair was styled, his face was clean, and his gaze was as cold as a mountain lake. It took a long, breathless moment for the room to realize it was Liam Moore. Arthur's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He gripped the microphone so hard his knuckles turned white. He barked into the speakers, demanding to know how this thief had gotten past security. He shouted for the guards to throw the trash back onto the street where he belonged. Mrs. Gable stood nearby, pointing a manicured finger and shrieking that it was a disgrace for a criminal to stand in a room filled with respectable citizens. She checked her watch with a theatrical flourish, snapping her fingers at the staff as if they were dogs, demanding they call the authorities immediately. Liam didn't flinch. He didn't shout back or beg for mercy. He simply kept walking until he was standing at the foot of the stage, looking up at the man who had discarded his mother like a piece of refuse. Behind Liam, a phalanx of 3 stone-faced men in dark suits entered the room, carrying leather briefcases that looked like they contained the weight of the world. Liam looked at Arthur, and for the first time, he didn't see a giant. He saw a frail, bitter old man clinging to a pile of stolen bricks. Arthur's laughter turned into a jagged, nervous sound as he looked at the lawyers. He tried to maintain his smug composure, telling the guests that this was clearly a desperate stunt by a delusional boy. He leaned over the podium, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and rot, and whispered to Liam that he would spend the rest of his life in a cell for this intrusion. But as Liam reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a single, embossed card, the air in the ballroom seemed to vanish. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was heavy, pressing down on the guests as they realized the unnamed primary shareholder the tech company had mentioned in their final contracts was standing right in front of them. The trap was fully set, the audience was gathered, and the king was about to realize he was standing on ground that no longer belonged to him. The silence in the ballroom was so absolute you could hear the soft hiss of the air conditioning against the gilded ceiling. Arthur Chen stood frozen on the stage, his hands still hovering over the microphone as if he were trying to grasp the authority that was rapidly evaporating from the room. He looked at the legal documents Liam's lawyers were sliding onto the podium, and the color drained from his face with the speed of a closing curtain. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a pathetic, dry rasp. He shook his head, a frantic, rhythmic twitch, stammering that this was impossible, that his father would never have betrayed him. Liam didn't wait for him to find his breath. He stepped up onto the stage, not with a hurried rush, but with the steady, heavy tread of a rightful king reclaiming a throne. He leaned into the microphone, his voice no longer the timid whisper of a delivery boy, but a deep, resonant boom that vibrated in the chests of everyone present. He told the room, and the man trembling beside him, that heritage isn't just about the blood in your veins. It's about the promises you keep and the people you protect. He revealed the truth that had been buried for 40 years, that the very soil this mansion sat upon had been left to Mei-Ling and her heirs to ensure that the Chen legacy actually stood for something more than just cruelty. Mrs. Gable tried to slink toward the back of the room, her emerald silk rustling loudly in the quiet, but David, the assistant, stepped into her path with a look of grim satisfaction. He held up a tablet, projecting a high-resolution security feed from the charity auction months prior onto the massive screens behind the stage. The entire room watched in high definition as Mrs. Gable's own hand slipped her diamond watch into her purse while she laughed with a glass of wine. The gasps from the socialites were like the sound of 1,000 paper cuts. She turned a sickly shade of gray, her mouth hanging open as her social standing disintegrated in a matter of seconds. Arthur turned to Liam, his eyes wide and bloodshot, and tried to backpedal with a sudden, sickening display of fake affection. He reached out a trembling hand, calling Liam, "my grandson," for the first time in his life, suggesting they go into the study to discuss this misunderstanding, like family. He tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace of terror. He promised Liam everything, the cars, the company, a seat at the head of the table, if they could just make the lawyers go away. Liam looked at the hand reaching toward him and felt nothing but a profound, hollow pity. He didn't take it. Instead, he leaned in and delivered the killing blow in a whisper that the microphone caught perfectly for the entire room to hear. He told Arthur that he had already bought every cent of his private debt through a series of shell companies. He told him that Chen Corp didn't exist anymore, and that the Golden Dragon was being served with an immediate eviction notice. He told Arthur that he was no longer a billionaire, or a CEO, or even a landlord. He was just a man who had traded his daughter's life for a house that didn't belong to him. The shock was too much for Arthur's brittle heart. He clutched his chest, his knees buckling as he collapsed into the velvet chair on the stage. He looked out at the guests, the elite he had spent his life trying to impress, and saw them already turning away, checking their phones and whispering to each other, ready to move on to the next person with power. Not a single person stepped forward to help him. Liam looked down at the man who had let his mother die in poverty and felt the weight of 30 years finally lift from his shoulders. Justice hadn't just been served, it had been executed with surgical precision. Liam signaled to the security team, the men Arthur had once paid, and they stepped forward to escort the former billionaire out of the building. The reign of the Golden Dragon was over, and as Liam stood alone in the center of the stage, the applause that finally broke out wasn't for the money, but for the man who had survived the storm. The heavy, ornate doors of the Golden Dragon estate swung open for the last time under the Chen name, but it wasn't a celebration. Arthur Chen was wheeled out in a generic transport chair, his once sharp tuxedo rumpled and his eyes staring blankly at the gravel driveway he used to prize so highly. The banks had moved with terrifying speed, seizing the luxury sedans and the frozen accounts, leaving him with nothing but a small suitcase of clothes and the bitter taste of defeat. Across town, Mrs. Gable found herself facing the cold reality of a courtroom. Her reputation had shattered so completely that even her own lawyers looked at her with disgust. The neighborhood watch she once led with an iron fist now ignored her frantic calls, and she was forced to sell her own home just to pay the legal fees for a theft she thought she was too rich to be caught for. Liam stood on the balcony of the estate, watching the sunset bleed across the San Francisco skyline. He didn't feel the surge of ego he had expected. Instead, he felt a profound, quiet peace. Within a month, the Golden Dragon signs were taken down, replaced by a simple, elegant plaque that read, the Mei-Ling Chen Community Center. The sprawling ballroom, once filled with the hollow laughter of the elite, was now filled with the sounds of children learning, families receiving legal aid, and immigrants finding the bridge to a new life that his mother had been denied. Liam spent his days in the gardens, not as a master, but as a guardian. He used the vast fortune not to buy more walls, but to tear them down, ensuring that no mother would ever have to choose between her child and her dignity again. 5 years later, the cycle of karma reached its final, silent conclusion. Liam pulled up to a modest, state-run nursing home on the outskirts of the city. He walked down the sterile, linoleum-tiled hallways that smelled of industrial bleach and loneliness. In a small room at the end of the hall, he found a frail, white-haired man staring out a window at a parking lot. Arthur Chen was a shadow of the giant he had once been. He didn't have a private chef or a fleet of assistants. He had a plastic tray of lukewarm food and a roommate who snored. When Arthur turned and saw Liam, his eyes didn't flare with anger. They filled with a sudden, devastating realization of everything he had thrown away for the sake of a pride that had left him with nothing. Liam sat beside him, not saying a word. He didn't come to gloat or to twist the knife. He simply sat there, offering the one thing Arthur had refused to give Mei-Ling, his presence. Arthur's hand, thin as parchment and trembling, reached out toward Liam's sleeve. He tried to speak, a single word of regret catching in his throat, but the silence between them was too heavy to break. Arthur Chen died that night, alone in that sterile room, but his eyes had closed having finally seen the man his grandson had become, a man who was rich in all the ways that truly mattered. The next morning, Liam stood at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, the salt spray misting his face. He opened a small urn and let the last of his mother's ashes catch the wind, watching them dance over the waves before disappearing into the infinite blue. He realized then that the greatest inheritance wasn't the land or the gold. It was the ability to walk through the world with a clean heart. He turned away from the water and walked back toward the city, ready to continue the work they had started together. The world often judges us by the clothes we wear, the color of our skin, or the balance of our accounts, but life has a way of stripping all of that away in the end. At the close of the day, we are only the kindness we gave and the love we chose to keep. True legacy isn't built of stone and iron. It is built in the lives we touch and the justice we uphold when no one is watching.